Tonight, welcome to a quiet corner of history, a place where the voices of the past soften into whispers, and the old stories move as gently as the evening wind. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day you've had, you can set it all down for a little while. Let the room grow calm around you. Let your breathing slow and come with me into an older world, one shaped by stone walls, distant battlefields, and the quiet footsteps of people who lived through both. In this video, you're going to hear the full drifting tale of an age when war was changing, when kings looked at the world around them and tried to reshape it with careful plans, cold stone, and the strength of ordinary hands. We'll move slowly through the fields, where the English longbow rose like a wooden storm, turning proud knights into shadows on the grass, through the hedged lanes of Poitiers and the sloping ridges of Crécy, where distance and patience mattered more than shining armour. And then gently we'll cross the sea and walk the coast of Wales, where Edward de Certain built his ring of iron, castles like Caernarfon, Conwy and Harlech, stone crowns pressed onto a land that carried older memories. You'll hear how those walls were raised, not just as fortresses but as symbols, how they shaped the people who lived beneath them, and how silence itself became part of the story. None of this will rush you. Every moment in this journey will unfold slowly, like pages turning in a book read by candlelight. You'll meet archers standing in the dusk with calloused hands, villagers whose lives bent under the weight of distant kings, and children who grew up with towers on their horizon and stories older than those stones in their hearts. All you need to do is listen. Let the world around you fade just a little. Let the past rise like mist on a quiet hill. And as the tale goes on, if your eyes begin to feel heavy, if the rhythm of these old stories begins to rock you gently towards sleep, that is exactly how these histories were meant to be heard, so settle in. Tonight, we walk together through the calm shadows of longbows and iron rings, through a world that has been waiting very patiently to tell you its story. On a quiet night long after the battles had faded, when only the wind still moved across the empty fields of Europe, the story of the Plantagenet Wars could be told like a slow, low song. In the stillness, it was hard to imagine that these same fields had once shaken under hooves and armour, that the sky had once turned dark, not with clouds, but with arrows. Yet that was where it all began, with a world that believed it already understood war, and with a few men who were about to change it without even knowing. Before the longbow rose to fame, the battlefield was the kingdom of the night. Heavy armour shone in the sun like moving statues. Shields bore bright colours and painted lions. Songs were written about charges that broke enemy lines in one great shining moment. To many people, war was a stage where nobles proved their courage while peasants watched from far away. But beneath the glitter of banners, something else was happening. The ground was changing. The kings of the Plantagenet line ruled a realm stretched across sea and land, and they needed more than glory. They needed order, numbers, and tools that could be trusted not just by a few chosen knights, but by many hands. In the long shadows of their reign, war slowly turned into something colder, a problem to be solved, a pattern to be learned. On the edges of this world, in quiet villages where boys learned to work the land, another kind of training was taking place. There, a simple piece of wood and a string could shape a life. A long, strong bough, taller than its user, carved from yew, waited in the corner of a cottage or hung on a wall darkened by smoke. To many, it was only a hunting tool, but to a few kings with sharp minds, it would soon become something like a key to power. These boys did not grow up in courts. They grew up in rain and mud, feeling the pull of the bow in their shoulders, counting their strength not in titles, but in how many arrows they could loose before their breath ran short. Their fingers toughened. Their backs bent slightly from years of drawing the heavy string. Day after day, their practice was quiet, almost invisible. No poets wrote about that. No heralds shouted their names. And yet their silent labour was slowly preparing the world for a new kind of storm. Far away, in stone halls lit by torches, Plantagenet kings listened to news from every corner of their lands. They heard of rebellions, raids, and rivals who wore crowns or dreamed of wearing them. They also knew something else, something very simple and very frightening. Knights were expensive. Knights died. Knights could betray. A king who chained his fate only to a few armoured men was like a man standing on a single narrow plank over deep water. One crack and he would fall. So, in the mind of a ruler like Edward III, a different question stirred. What if war could be spread out across many shoulders? What if power could be drawn back on a string by hands that had never touched a golden cup, only rough bread and simple tools? He looked not only at the chivalry that glittered, but also at the dark mass of common soldiers who, with the right training, might change the balance of everything. At the same time, another Edward, earlier in the line, Edward III, whom some would later call Longshanks, had already understood another part of the same puzzle. He knew that men with weapons were only half the answer. The other half was stone. Stone that rose into the sky, stone that watched over mountain passes and sea inlets, stone that said, without a word, this land is held. When he turned his gaze toward Wales, he did not see only hills and valleys. He saw possible strongholds, anchors of power that could hold down a restless people. In his mind, castles were not just homes or hiding places. They were tools, as sharp in their own way as any blade. And so while English boys were learning to bend their backs to the longbow, Welsh rock was being carved into towers, walls, and great gatehouses that cast long shadows over rivers and roads. One day, these two currents would meet on the map of Britain, and beyond it, on the muddy fields of France. But in the beginning, they were just quiet changes sliding under the surface of old customs. The knights still rode. The old songs were still sung. On feast days, torches still lit up. Great halls where stories of past charges and duels were told again and again. Few people realized that the next stories would sound different, that the heroes would not always be mounted men with shining spears, but sometimes small figures with bowed heads and calloused hands, standing behind wooden stakes and listening for the order to release. War, which had once been dressed in silk and chainmail, began to wear a plainer face. It turned into lines and distances, into angles of fire, and the simple question of who could reach whom first. It hid itself in the curve of an arrow's flight, in the thickness of a wall, in the way a gate opened onto a narrow killing ground. And slowly, in the minds of a few watchful people, the idea formed that victory might depend less on noble pride and more on who understood these hidden lines better. On some nights, if one could stand invisible at the edge of a Welsh cliff, looking down at the rising shape of Caernarfon or Conwy under the moon, the work would look almost peaceful. Masons would rest their tools. The half-built walls would hold shadows like still water. No one would hear the echo of future marching feet, or the quiet fear of those forced to live under these stone giants. In the same way, in the English countryside, a group of young archers could be seen practicing at dusk, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. Arrows would rise and fall, thudding into distant targets. The sound was small, almost gentle, but each thud was a tiny step toward battles that would one day be remembered as turning points in the art of war. Perhaps that is how change always moves through history, not in constant thunder, but in quiet, repeated actions that no one pays much attention to at first. A boy draws a bowstring again and again. A king signs an order to build yet another castle. A village adjusts to the presence of stone walls on the horizon. None of them can see the whole pattern, but the pattern is there, taking shape, like threads slowly woven together on a loom. And somewhere far away, beyond the farms and the rising towers, beyond the campfires and the torch-lit halls, the first faint outline of new battles was forming in the dark, like a road that no one had walked yet, but that was quietly beginning to open. As the shape of those unseen battles thickened in the dark, life on the ground moved in small, steady rhythms that did not look dramatic at all. In one English village, thin smoke rose from low roofs, and the morning began with the same sounds it always had. The clatter of buckets, the soft calling of animals, the murmur of people starting their day. Yet in the open field beyond the last cottage, something different was happening almost every afternoon. There were a group of boys and young men stood in a rough line, each holding a tall bow that reached from the ground to their chins, or even higher. The bows were simple to look at, just long curves of pale wood, but they were not simple to pull. Each one had been cut from the heart of a yew tree, where the pale sapwood and the darker core met. That marriage inside the wood gave the bow both strength and flexibility. In the dim corners of a carpenter's shed, shavings had fallen like curled leaves, as hands that knew their craft shaped each piece, smoothing the belly, thinning the limbs, testing the bend again and again. A poorly made bow could break and wound the archer who trusted it. A well-made one could send an arrow whistling far beyond what the eye expected. The villagers did not speak much of technology or military revolution. They only knew that the king's men had passed through, had spoken about old laws and new threats, and had reminded everyone that on certain days all who were fit must come out to practice the bow. Some grumbled, some were curious, some just obeyed, because that was how life worked. But for a few, especially the younger ones, there was a quiet kind of pride in feeling the weight of the string in their fingers. At first, their arrows wobbled and fell short. Arms shook, shoulders burned. A longbow could need the strength of years to draw it fully, and no one could cheat that. Muscles had to be built slowly, the way a tree thickens its rings. The village priest might stand at a distance, watching, his robes stirred by the same breeze that tugged at the fletchings of the arrows. Somewhere beyond him, the lord of the manor might lean on a fence rail, judging which of these boys could one day stand in his retinue, but most of the time there was no audience at all. Just a wooden stake or a painted circle on a board set far away, and the simple command to knock, draw, and loose. The sound of the bowstring slapping forward was sharp but brief. Then came the softer thud of impact, if the shot was true. The archers learned to listen for that thud the way a musician listens for the right note. They learned to feel the wind on their faces, to guess how it would push at their arrows. They learned to judge distance not by counting steps, but by how small a target looked and how long the arrow seemed to hang in the air before dropping. Over time, their bodies changed without them fully noticing. Their left hands grew knotted and strong. The bones of their arms thickened. Their chests widened to house lungs that could feed the effort of repeated draws. Years later, when archaeologists would study the skeletons of medieval archers, they would find these marks in the bones themselves, as if the longbow had written its own story into the body of every man who had served it. But the archers of that time did not think of bones or history. They thought of aching muscles, of blisters, of small moments when an arrow finally struck exactly where it had been meant to go. Sometimes an older soldier who had already marched in the King's Wars would wander over and correct a stance, push a shoulder down, shift a foot. He might tell a quiet story about a battle far away, about how a wall of arrows could make even proud riders turn their horses aside. The boys would listen, with big eyes, trying to imagine a sky darkened by shafts, an enemy line breaking in confusion. Then the story would end, and the work would go on. Because skill in war, like any craft, was built on repetition that almost felt like prayer. In towns and ports, similar scenes unfolded. Practice butts were set up near the edges of streets, sometimes so close to houses that arrows buried themselves in boards when a shot went wild. Kings like Edward III understood that if they wanted an army of archers, it could not be built only at the moment of war. It had to grow inside the daily life of the realm. So laws and orders gently but firmly pushed people toward archery, weaving it into holidays and gatherings, making it a familiar sight. As years passed, a new kind of confidence settled in the minds of English commanders. They began to plan with the longbow in mind, to imagine battles not just as brave charges, but as careful stages set for rainstorms of arrows. They looked for slopes, for narrow approaches, for soft ground that would slow horses. They thought about how to place men with stakes in front of them, how to force enemies to come forward into zones where the arrows would be thickest. Somewhere between their maps and the rough fields of the villages, a bridge was forming. When a king like Edward III called for his host to gather, the archers who answered were not raw and unready. They were men who had already spent much of their lives talking with the bow in the air. They marched with quivers full and strings well waxed, knowing that on the other side of the sea, opponents still trusted in flashing armour and heavy lances. On some quiet night, as a troop of these men camped on French soil for the first time, the scene might almost have looked peaceful. Fires crackled, pots simmered, a few archers oiled their bows or checked for cracks, running their fingers along the wood as gently as if it were a living thing. Others lay on their backs, staring up at unfamiliar stars, wondering what the morning would bring. The commanders moved from group to group, thinking not in stories of glory, but in lines and ranges, in how far their archers could reach and where to place them when the enemy came. They knew that many who listened to them were simple men, not trained to read or write, but they also knew that these same men held in their hands the power to change the shape of war. If someone, somewhere, had been listening to this scene as a story told long after, perhaps in a dark room with only a small lamp burning, they might feel a strange pull in their chest. The idea that ordinary hands could shift the fate of kingdoms is a quiet but strong kind of wonder. And if that listener, lying in bed with their own day finally fading, felt this long journey through forgotten wars and sleeping fields gently drawing them in, they might choose to stay with it, to follow the tale from night to night, and maybe, if they wished, to tap the small button that lets these soft old stories find their way back to them again. For now, though, in the world of the Plantagenets, the first armies of archers were gathering like shadows at the edge of a great stage. The French knights did not yet fully understand what was coming. They still trusted the weight of steel and the charge of horses. But far from their bright heraldry and bright words, the bowstrings were ready, the yew had been shaped, and the men who would stand behind the stakes had already learned the feel of calm in the breath just before release. Somewhere ahead, a field called Crécy waited under future rain and sun. Still quiet, still only a place of grass and soil. Soon enough, the steps of both knight and archer would press into that earth, and the sky above it would remember a very different kind of storm, one that was already beginning to form in the minds and muscles of men who, for now, were only practicing in the fading light. The day that would become Crécy did not at first look like the turning of an age. It began with soft light stretching across the French countryside, with dew on the grass and mist rising from low places. The English host moved slowly, tired from marching and from days of worry about food and enemies. Men adjusted straps, led horses by the reins, shifted the weight of their packs. Somewhere in the middle of that long snake of people and animals walked the archers, their bows unstrung for the march, their arrows bundled and carried, their eyes scanning the land ahead, without quite knowing why their hearts felt tight. Their king, Edward III, had been thinking much more clearly about that feeling. He knew he was far from home on hostile soil. He knew the French army was larger, proud, and eager to crush him. To stand in an open field and let them come as they wished would be simple suicide. So, as the sun rose higher, he looked not just at the enemy, but at the shape of the land, the slope of the ground, the softness of the soil underfoot. War, in his mind, had become as much about choosing the right place as about choosing the right moment. He saw a gentle ridge, a rise in the earth that gave his men a little height. He saw fields that would be hard for horses to cross at speed, patches of soft ground that might steel their strength and break their order. This, he decided, would be where he made his stand. Under his orders, the long, tired column folded itself into a line. Banners were planted. Men-at-arms in armour took their places toward the centre, ready to hold if the enemy reached them. But in front of them and along the sides where the French might try to curl in, the archers were told to drive stakes into the ground. Each archer took a sharp wooden stake and hammered it in at an angle, creating a fence of points facing outward. It was not beautiful. It was not noble in the old sense. It was practical. Horses might crash into such a fence, but would not do so easily twice. Behind these rough defences, the archers strung their bows, checking each string with careful fingers, making sure it was dry, tight, and strong. They lined up in shallow ranks, not too deep, so that many could shoot without hitting the men in front. Some chewed bits of bread or dried meat while they waited. Others were silent, just feeling the weight of the bow in their hands, trusting the years that had shaped their bodies. Far away, dust rose on the horizon like a low cloud. The French army was coming. Its leaders believed they were walking toward one more scene of glory, another chance for knights to charge and prove themselves. They had numbers. They had banners that shone with colour. They had armour that gleamed like water in the sun. They also had a deep old faith in the power of heavily armed men on horseback. To them, the English line probably looked thin, tired, and strangely still. They did not yet understand the meaning of those stakes or the figures with long bows. Between the two forces, the field lay open and quiet, as if it did not care who claimed it. A light wind moved through the grass. Above, the sky watched with a calm, blue eye that had seen many battles before and would see many after. When the first French crossbowmen came forward, brought in from Genoa, they were tired and unhappy. Their strings had been dampened by rain, their shields heavy on their backs. They looked across at the English and saw rows of archers whose weapons were dry and whose king had chosen the ground well. A signal was given. The crossbowmen loosed a few bolts, but their range and force were poor that day. Then with a different sound, the longbows spoke. Arrows rose in black curves against the sky, many at once, so many that later men would say it was like a storm. They fell on the crossbowmen and on the space behind them. Men cried out and fell. The French knights, angry and impatient, did not wait to understand why their front was breaking. They drove their horses forward, forcing their own crossbowmen aside, adding confusion to fear. It was a mix of pride, frustration, and old habit. Knights charged. That was what knights did. Yet the ground they pushed onto was not kind to them. The soft earth sucked at hooves. The slope turned their rush into a climb. They found themselves riding into a valley of arrows. The English archers did what they had trained to do all their lives. They did not chase. They did not boast. They simply drew and loosed, sending shaft after shaft into the thick press of horses and armour. They aimed not for shining crests, but for the gaps, underarms, in visors, into horses' necks. Some arrows glanced off, but others found their mark. A knight hit in the wrong place could fall and drag others with him. A wounded horse could stumble and throw its rider under the feet of those coming behind. Very quickly, the proud bright charge became a tangle of fallen bodies and struggling animals. The more waves came, the more the tangle grew. The French knights, brave but badly led that day, rode again and again into this narrowing funnel of death, their discipline dissolving in anger and shame. The English archers, standing behind their wooden teeth, kept shooting. Their arms ached, their fingers burned. Still they shot, because this was the moment all their quiet practice had been for. If someone had paused the world at that instant and walked through the field like a ghost, they would have seen many small sharp scenes. An archer blinking sweat from his eyes as he grabbed another arrow, a horse rearing, struck and mad with pain, a knight lying on his back, looking up at a sky that had turned dark with shafts instead of clouds. In the centre, King Edward watched, not with joy exactly, but with the heavy knowledge that his plan was working, that his trust in common men and simple wood was paying off in blood. Behind him, the men-at-arms waited with weapons ready, knowing that if the storm of arrows did its work, the enemy would reach them already broken. And still, from far away, the great stone shapes of Wales stood silent, the castles of Edwardnas gazing out over mountains and sea. They were not part of this battle, but they belonged to the same way of thinking. War as planning, as shaping space, as using what the world offered, stone, slope, distance, and the labour of many hands, to hold power and break resistance. Longshanks had used stone to bind Wales. Edward III was using yew and iron heads to hold his ground in France. Both were threads in the same dark cloth. As the day at Crécy went on, it became clear that the old image of war, with its shining, unstoppable charges, was tearing like a thin cloak in a storm. The longbow, in ranks and in trained hands, behaved almost like a machine, sending out death in a steady rhythm that did not care about noble birth or fine armour. The knights who had once seemed like walking fortresses were forced to learn that on certain ground, under a certain sky, they were only targets. By evening, when the light began to soften and the cries grew fewer, the field was no longer just a place. It had become a lesson written in bodies and broken gear, a message to anyone who cared to read it, that war had changed and that those who did not change with it would fall. Yet even then, the archers who survived did not feel like great inventors. They were tired, hungry, and sore. Some sat on the ground, hands trembling, staring at the mess they had helped create. Some silently thanked God. Some thought of home. Above them, the sky slowly cleared of arrows and returned to simple blue and gold. Night would come soon, wrapping the field in darkness, hiding the worst of what had been done. And somewhere beyond that darkness, in years yet to pass, other kings and builders would take this lesson and carry it into their own plans, linking storms of arrows and rings of stone into a wider story of how power holds and breaks. For now, the day at Crécy was ending, and in that long, cooling silence, The faint sound of hammers on stone in distant Wales seemed to echo softly with each memory of bowstrings and falling knights, hinting that this was not an ending at all, but only one more step along a hard, unrolling path. In the days and months after Crécy, the story of that strange storm of arrows spread more quickly than any messenger could ride. It slipped from campfire to campfire, from tavern to hall, like a quiet rumour that would not die. Some told it with excitement, speaking of how a smaller, weary English host had stopped the great pride of France. Others spoke with a slower, uneasy voice, as if they sensed that what had happened there was more than just one lucky battle. Lords who had not been present tried to picture it in their minds, ranks of common archers standing behind sharp stakes on a slope, cutting down armoured knights who had once seemed almost untouchable. For many, that image did not sit well. It pushed against old ways of thinking that had been held for generations, where noble blood and heavy armour were meant to be the surest shields a man could have. Yet the fields of France did not care about feelings. They had felt the weight of falling horses and heard the snap of broken lances. They knew very simply what had happened, that distance and angle, training and patience had become weapons just as much as steel and courage. In royal councils, far from the mud and blood, men with titles and bright clothes began to speak new words. They spoke of ranges, of how far a longbow could reach. They spoke of rates of fire, of how many arrows could be loosed in a minute by practiced hands. Some even began to wonder whether investing in more archers might be wiser than endlessly polishing the armour of a few expensive knights. The Plantagenet court, with its long memory of both victory and trouble, listened closely. Edward III, who had watched Crécy with his own eyes, understood that what he had done there could not be repeated in exactly the same way every time. Enemies learn, even when they do not wish to. But he also understood that he had found something that could give him an edge again and again if used with care. In his mind, the longbow was no longer just a tool. It was a promise, a way of making the battlefield bend slightly toward him, even on days when fortune seemed unsure. Across the sea, in France, there were those who refused to believe that such a weapon could truly change the order of things. They blamed the weather, the ground, the poor behaviour of this commander or that. They told themselves that knights had always risen again after defeats, shining once more in the next battle. Yet even among them, there were a few who felt a chill when they heard how many arrows had flown, how thick the air had become with feathered death. They could not escape the thought that a man in plain cloth, standing far away, might decide the fate of a lord in bright steel with a single well-aimed shot. While these thoughts turned in distant chambers, the archers who had lived through Crécy went back to the rhythms they knew. Some were sent home, their service done for a time. They walked the roads with coin in their pouches and tiredness in their bones, returning to villages where people wanted to hear every detail of the fight. Others remained with the king, marching onward, for war had not ended with one victory. The long struggle that would be called the 100 Years' War still had many chapters waiting to be written. On quiet evenings, a few of these men found themselves thinking of the battle in simple personal ways. The way their hands had moved, almost without needing thought. The way the world had narrowed to bow, string, breath, and target. Some wondered at how small they had felt, one man among thousands, and yet how large their actions had become when added together. It was as if each arrow had been a word in a story, and only when the last one fell did the full meaning appear. Far to the west, the castles of Wales continued to grow older under the same restless sky. Caernarfon, with its striped stone walls and polygonal towers, watched the tides move in and out. Conwy, perched above its river, held the light of sunsets in its windows and arrow slits. Harlech clung to its rocky hill, listening to the constant breath of the sea. They had been built in an earlier generation by Edward I, who had believed in the power of stone to trap and control a land that did not want to be tamed. His builders had chosen their sites as carefully as Edward III chose his battlefields, looking for heights that commanded valleys, for river bends that could be guarded, for coasts where a castle could both receive supplies and cast a cold gaze over the waters. Around these walls, towns had grown up slowly, like plants huddling at the base of a tree. Welsh villages moved through their days under the watch of towers that never blinked. The presence of those fortresses was a constant heavy reminder that someone far away claimed this land by right of conquest. For some, they were prisons of the spirit. For others, they were simply part of the landscape, as unchangeable as cliffs or clouds. Yet in their own silent way, these castles were part of the same story that was unfolding in France. They showed how power had started to think differently, not just in terms of brave charges and sudden raids, but in patterns that lasted for years and stretched across maps. A ring of stone in Wales, a line of archers on a ridge in France. Both were expressions of rulers who understood that control of space, whether for a single day's battle or for generations of rule, was the true heart of war. On some nights, if one imagined standing on the walls of Harlech, the wind carrying the smell of the sea and the faint cries of distant birds, one might feel the deep loneliness that often hides inside great displays of strength. A castle could be magnificent, yet still be a place of long waiting, of watching horizons for enemies who might never come. In the same way, an archer's life could look simple from afar, yet inside it held years of quiet labour, of bending the body to the will of a weapon that demanded respect. Both stone and yew asked for something from the people who served them: time, effort, and acceptance that safety and victory were never completely free. As the seasons turned, the lessons of Crécy sank deeper into the minds of those who paid attention. Plans were made for new campaigns. Maps were unrolled on tables, marked with rivers, hills, and castles. When commanders traced their fingers across these lines, they were not only thinking of where armies might march, they were thinking of where archers could stand, where walls could anchor a defence, where narrow passes or muddy fields could pull courage down into confusion. War, which had once been thought of as a clash of heroes, was becoming more clearly a matter of design. And yet for the ordinary people living under these designs, life went on with its small joys and worries. Children played in the shadows of battlements. Farmers cursed the weather more often than they cursed kings. In distant parishes, bells rang for weddings and funerals without ever mentioning Crécy or the purpose behind the castles on the hills. History often moves like that, half awake and half asleep, with only a few eyes really seeing the shape of the path ahead. The next great test of the longbow's silent promise would come at another place, under another sky, where French pride and English planning would meet once more. But for now, the world stood in a kind of breath between battles, with arrows still being made, walls still standing firm, and the quiet thought growing that what had happened once on a sloping field could, under the right conditions, happen again. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of any one man's sight, the road that had passed through Crécy was bending slowly toward a place called Poitiers, and the night itself seemed to listen, as if it knew that another storm was waiting to be born. By the time the road finally curved toward Poitiers, the memory of Crécy was like a stone dropped into a deep pond, its ripples still moving outward, even when the first splash had long since faded. On maps spread out in quiet chambers, Poitiers was just another name, another place where lines of march might cross. But in the minds of those who had lived through earlier battles, it was also a chance Perhaps for the French to wipe away the stain of defeat, perhaps for the English to prove that Crécy had not been a strange accident of a mud and luck. The sky above Poitiers was wide and watchful when the two forces drew near. The English, led now by Edward, the Black Prince, carried with them not only their weapons, but also the lessons their fathers and comrades had learned. They knew that to stand in the open and trust in courage alone would be foolish. So once again, they began to look at the land the way a craftsman looks at wood or stone, searching for shapes they could use. They found a position edged by hedges and vineyards, with rising ground and narrow approaches that would squeeze any attackers into tighter paths. It was not a grand field fit for a courtly spectacle. It was a place where those who understood range, cover, and timing could make numbers matter a little less. Behind rough hedgerows and among the vines, the English soldiers settled in. The men-at-arms took their places with shields and spears, ready to close if the line was pressed. But, as before, the longbowmen were arranged where they could see the approaches, where their arrows could fan out over the paths the French would have to take. They drove stakes into the earth again, feeling the familiar rhythm of wood-striking soil. To a careless eye, it might have looked chaotic. Plants, hedge, earth, men. To a careful eye, it was a net being quietly pulled across the space where the battle would happen. On the other side, the French host was large and full of anger. They had heard all the stories of Crécy, and many among them burned with the desire to prove that such a humiliation could not happen twice. Their armour shone, their banners flooded. Their leaders spoke defiantly of honour and revenge. But beneath the fine words, there were currents of tension, disagreements about how to attack, pride that made it hard to wait or to listen to advice. Some suggested caution, approach by approach, with archers and infantry working carefully together. Others, more eager for glory, believed that sheer weight and bravery would crush the English, no matter where they stood. In the end, the old habits spoke loudest. The French came forward in great heavy waves, difficult to control once they were set in motion. The ground that had seemed harmless from a distance began to reveal its tricks. Narrow lanes forced men into crowded files. Vines and hedges broke their order. The slope pulled at their legs, slowing them at exactly the moment when they needed speed. From behind their rough cover, the English archers watched these shapes approaching, feeling the same tightness in their chests that they had felt at Crécy. They checked their strings, lifted their bows, and waited for the signal. When it came, it was almost gentle, just a word or a gesture. Then the air filled again with that dark, whispering rain. Arrows hissed through leaves and branches, fell into the advancing ranks, struck shields, armour, and unprotected flesh. The French pushed on, but every step forward seemed to bring them into thicker fire. Knights who had imagined themselves cutting clean paths through weaker men found themselves instead flinching under invisible blows from far away. Some fell. Others pressed forward over their bodies, hearts hardened by training and desperation. The English line held, not with wild shouts, but with steady, disciplined work. Archers loosed until their shoulders burned, then loosed again. Men-at-arms watched the gaps, ready to step in where the line trembled. The Black Prince, though young, moved among his troops, offering quiet encouragement, showing them by his presence that he too trusted the plan, trusted the ground, trusted the humble bow that had become his family's unlikely shield. In the chaos of the French advance, something important began to happen, something that could not be seen from a distance, but could be felt in the hearts of the men involved. The old certainty that noble blood guaranteed victory began to crack. For the second time in a generation, heavily armoured lords found that their fate lay in the hands of men they might once have passed in the street without a second glance. A nameless archer, half hidden behind a hedge, could send an arrow that decided whether a great nobleman lived or died, whether a whole flank held or broke. The battle swayed and shifted, with moments when it seemed the French might still break through. But the tightness of the ground and the steadiness of the English formation kept turning their strength back on itself. Finally, like a storm that has spent its fury against a cliff, the French effort began to falter. Their lines broke into fragments. Groups of men were surrounded, cut off, or forced to surrender. Dust and cries rose into the sky, mingling with the last tired flights of arrows. When it was over, Poitiers lay behind the English as another dark page written in the same script as Crécy. Smaller force, careful ground, longbow, discipline. A French king was taken prisoner. Ransoms would be argued over. Treaties would be written and broken. But beneath all of that, a deeper truth had rooted itself in the soil of Europe, that war was no longer simply a contest of shining champions, but a craft in which understanding wind, earth, and the silent labour of common men could tilt the whole balance of power. The archers who survived Poitiers carried their memories home, along with whatever coins or small trophies they had gained. In villages already used to seeing practice butts on feast days, their stories joined those of Crécy, turning the longbow into something half real and half legend. Fathers who had stood at Poitiers might watch their sons draw the bowstring and see not just a child's game, but a faint echo of the slopes and hedges where they had once stood between life and death. And somewhere, perhaps in a quiet room, where someone lay listening with heavy eyes, drifting slowly towards sleep, these tales of forgotten fields and whispering arrows might feel like waves against a distant shore, soft, steady, strangely comforting in their rhythm. If, in those moments, the listener felt that these old stories, told gently under an invisible candlelight, were worth returning to, they might let their hand, almost without thinking, find the small button that invites more of them in nights to come, so that history could keep them company as they rest. Far away from Poitiers, the castles of Wales still cut their shapes against the sky, their stones holding the chill of many winters. They had seen no longbow storms, but they belonged to the same way of thinking that had won in France, that space, time, and quiet preparation could bend even the proudest enemy. Soon, the tale would turn more fully toward those rings of stone, toward the way Edward the First had carved his will into the very landscape of a conquered country. For now, though, the echoes of Crécy and Poitiers still hung in the air, like arrows that had flown too far to be seen, yet whose impact could still be felt in the trembling of an age that did not yet know how much it had changed. While the memory of Crécy var Poitiers was still fresh in the minds of men who counted arrows and prisoners, there was another part of the Plantagenet story that lay farther to the west, quiet and solid, as if it had always been there, long before English longbows had darkened the sky over French fields. Another Edward, Edward the First, had turned his thoughts toward a different kind of war. His enemies were not foreign kings across the sea, but the proud princes and stubborn valleys of Wales, where old songs and old freedoms had taken root deep in the hills. When he looked at that land, he did not see only mist and mountains. He saw a challenge written in rock, and he chose to answer it with stone of his own. The conquest of Wales did not happen in a single flash of glory. It was a slow tightening, like a hand closing around something that struggled. There were campaigns and marches, skirmishes in narrow passes, and moments when Welsh resistance burned hot and bright before being pushed back again. Edward was not a man to be satisfied with half measures. He wanted more than a victory on paper. He wanted a lasting hold, something that would outlive any one battle. In his mind, a castle was not just a strong house. It was a message carved into the landscape, a reminder that did not need words. So he began to build what people would one day call a ring of iron, a chain of fortresses stretching across key points of Wales, each linked by the sea or by roads, each placed where it could watch, threaten and protect. Imagine, for a moment, the first time a Welsh villager saw the rising walls of Caernarfon. The site had been chosen with care at the edge of the Menai Strait, where water flowed like a moving mirror between mainland and island. The foundations bit into old Roman ground as if Edward wanted to borrow the weight of empires past. Little by little, towers rose, not smooth and round like many older castles, but with sharp polygonal faces and bands of different coloured stone that made the walls look striped in the light. To an ordinary eye, these stripes were only pretty or strange. To an eye trained in symbols, they whispered of imperial dreams, of a king who wanted to dress himself in the memory of Rome and of Arthur. Around the building site, the sounds were constant, the crack of stone being split, the rasp of saws through timber, the shout of foremen directing gangs of workers who spoke in more than one language. There were English labourers, but there were also men from other parts of the king's wide domains, all pulled here by pay, duty, or command. They hauled blocks, mixed lime, raised scaffolding. Day after day, under sun and rain, they turned Edward's drawings and orders into walls that would one day cast long shadows over the strait. Nearby, Welsh families watched this with mixed feelings. Some saw only danger, a great stone fist closing over their land. Some saw the chance for trade and coin, selling food or small goods to the hungry mouths around the works. Children might stand on a ridge and count the new towers, not yet understanding what it meant to live under their gaze. At night, when the work stopped and the tools lay silent, the half-finished castle looked almost like a sleeping animal, ribs of timber sticking out, dark gaps where windows and gates would be. In those quiet hours, the land itself seemed to whisper its own old stories of princes who had once gathered their fighters by torchlight, of roads that had never known a foreign king's patrols. Yet the new walls did not listen. They rose because Edward's will and gold pushed them upward, and because enough hands lifted enough stones in the right order. Conwy, another jewel in this iron ring, took shape on a rock above a winding river. Its 8 great towers stood like watchful candles around an inner flame of activity. Below it, a town began to grow, laid out on a neat plain that did not match the old wandering paths of Welsh villages. Straight streets, walls around the settlement, gates that could be closed at night. These were not just protections, they were ways of organising life itself, making sure that trade, law and loyalty flowed toward the castle first. Harlech, perhaps the loneliest of them all, clung to a rocky outcrop near the sea, its walls dropping sheer on one side, daring any attacker to climb. A narrow, hidden way, a way of the sea, allowed supplies to be brought in by boat when the land was troubled. In winter storms, the castle must have felt like a stone ship anchored to the cliff, its garrison listening to the roar of waves and the whistle of wind through arrow slits. For the men who lived in these castles, daily life was a mixture of boredom and alertness. Guards paced the walls, their boots echoing softly on stone. Cooks stirred pots in smoky kitchens. Priests said prayers in small chapels where the sound of the sea sometimes drowned their words. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes and hinges, sparks briefly lighting corners of courtyards. Every now and then, a messenger would arrive with news of unrest, or a royal official would come to inspect, to make sure that the king's will was being properly carried out, even in these far, hard places. Outside the walls, Welsh eyes watched. Resistance did not disappear just because stone had risen. It shifted, hiding in the folds of the hills, in night raids, in quiet refusal. There were songs that mourned the loss of old freedoms and mocked the heavy foreign towers. There were also uneasy agreements, alliances of necessity, men who decided that living under the shadow of the castles was safer than dying in front of them. Perhaps on some long winter evening, a Welsh storyteller sat by a low fire and spoke of these new fortresses as if they were strange giants, not fully belonging to the land, even though their roots were sunk deep in its rock. In a way, these castles and the longbows that would later sing in France came from the same cold thought, that power could be made more sure by planning carefully how men and materials met the world. Edward to found it had looked at Wales and said, "I will hold it with stone." Edward III would look at France and think, "I will hold my ground with you and trained hands." Both saw that courage alone was not enough. The world was becoming a place where walls, weapons, and the careful use of space could weigh as heavily as any crown on the scale of fate. As the years passed, storms beat on the towers of Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech. Moss crept into cracks. Seabirds nested on ledges. Children who had been born in their shadow grew up thinking they had always been part of the hills and shores. Yet if one stood on a battlement at dusk, feeling the stone still warm from the day's sun, and looked out over the quiet lands below, it was possible to sense the sharp edge hidden inside this calm. These were not gentle buildings. They were clenched teeth around a conquered land, beautiful in a cold way, but always ready for trouble. And somewhere in that meeting between beauty and threat, between the stillness of the walls and the restless lives beneath them, another part of the story of war and power was waiting to be told, especially in one place, where striped stone and sharp towers watched the tide, and where, under the pale light of the moon, Caernarfon itself seemed to be listening for the next whisper of history to pass along its silent walls. On many evenings, when the sun sank low over the Menai Strait and the sky turned the colour of faded embers, Caernarfon took on a different face. In daylight, its striped stone walls looked proud and sharp, like a crown set too firmly on the brow of the land. But in the half-light of dusk, with shadows filling its angles, it could almost seem to hesitate, as if it knew it did not quite belong to the hills and water around it. Inside those walls, narrow streets ran in straight lines, lined with houses that leaned toward one another like tired people sharing a secret. The town had been laid out on a plan drawn somewhere far away, perhaps in a chamber where Edward's builders traced lines with ink and measured distances with string. There was a market square, a main gate, a way for carts to move and soldiers to pass. Nothing in the layout was left to chance. Even the way the streets met the castle gates had been chosen so that help could rush where it was needed, or a crowd could be quickly broken apart if it grew restless. To the garrison, this order felt safe. To some of the Welsh who lived under it, it felt like a net. At the heart of it all rose the castle itself, with its polygonal towers standing like pieces of a giant stone machine. Within those towers were rooms for storage, for sleeping, for watching. Narrow stairways curled upward inside thick walls, making defenders strong and attackers weak. Arrow slits were cut just so, wide on the inside to give archers room to move, thin on the outside to show as little weakness as possible. In the great gatehouse, heavy wooden doors and iron portcullises could be dropped in moments, turning open arches into a solid, snarling mouth of spikes and bars. Even the empty spaces were part of the design. Open courtyards allowed men to gather and form ranks quickly. The well was placed where it could be defended, even if outer parts of the castle fell. Every stone seemed to hold a reason. On some quiet night, a guard with a spear might lean on a parapet and look out at the dark sea, feeling the wind push against his cloak. He might think of home, perhaps a small farm in England, or a distant town across the Channel, and wonder how his life had led him here, to this cold, beautiful fortress, in a land that still hummed with songs he did not understand. Below him, in the town, a Welsh child might lie awake, listening to the faint sound of boots on the wall above, knowing that these footsteps were part of a power that had come from elsewhere. For that child, the castle was not only stone. It was a weight on every story told at the fireside, a shape always present at the edge of sight. In the corners of Caernarfon, where light from torches and candles did not quite reach, it was easy to feel that the building itself was listening. The patterned stone, said by some to echo Roman walls or speak of imagined emperors, seemed to watch with many eyes. For Edward, this had been the point. He wanted more than a strong shell. He wanted a symbol, a place that told everyone who saw it that a new order had taken root. If the longbow was meant to humble proud knights in open fields, Caernarfon was meant to humble a proud people in their own valleys. In both cases, the message was the same. The age of simple personal strength was giving way to something else, something that lived in systems and in designs. Yet symbols do not only speak one way. Over time, people living in the shadow of the castle began to weave it into their own thoughts and stories. Some learned to use its presence as a shield, finding safety inside its walls during raids or storms. Others gave it mocking names in whispered jokes, shrinking its pride with quiet laughter. A few, perhaps, dreamed of a day when the towers might stand empty, their great halls filled with nothing but dust and the echo of forgotten commands. If one were to walk, unseen, along the walls on a still night, moving from tower to tower, one would pass small scenes of very human life that existed inside this grand machine of conquest. In a guard room, a man might be mending his cloak, thread passing in and out of thick wool while he hummed a tune his mother had once sung. In the kitchen, someone would scrape the last bits from a pot, tired from a day of feeding officers and soldiers who rarely thought about where their food came from. In the chapel, a priest might kneel alone, his whispered prayers mixing with the distant sigh of the sea, asking for peace in a place built for control. Outside, beyond the reach of the wall's shadow, the hills rolled on, as they always had. Sheep grazed, streams found their way down to the sea. The wind, which did not care about kings or titles, ran its fingers over heather and stone, just as it had done long before any tower was raised. In the small farms scattered across the valleys, families went on living, planting, harvesting, mourning, and celebrating. The castles were impressive, but even they could not entirely drown out the older rhythm of the land. From time to time, resistance flared. Armed bands moved through the hills, using knowledge of every path and ridge to avoid patrols. They attacked supply lines, surprised small groups of soldiers, then vanished into forests and folds of ground that did not appear on any neat map. Each time they did, the castles answered with more patrols, harsher rules, tighter control, as if the stone ring were trying to squeeze harder. This back and forth was its own kind of war, less famous than battles like Crécy or Poitiers, but no less real. It was a war of patience, of daily choices, of how much pressure people could bear before they snapped. In his later years, Edward de Sailly might have looked at a map of Wales and felt a certain cold satisfaction. His ring of iron was complete. From Caernarfon to Conwy, from Harlech to other strongholds, his mark was all over the coast and deep in the heart of the land. Ships could move along the sea, bringing supplies from one castle to another. Messengers could ride from stronghold to stronghold, carrying orders that passed like a thread through every stone bead. From a distance, it might have seemed like a perfect chain, but inside the links of that chain were people, and people have thoughts memories, and quiet stubbornness. The castles could watch, threaten, and endure, but they could not erase the feeling in many hearts that something had been taken. In that feeling lay the seeds of future unrest, the kind that does not die easily even when walls stand firm. On a night when the moon was thin and the tide was low, someone standing on Caernarfon's walls might hear more than just the sea below. They might hear, if they listened deeply, the faint echo of bowstrings from distant fields in France, the whisper of arrows that had fallen years before, and the soft murmur of Welsh voices telling stories that refused to forget. All of these sounds together made a kind of song about power and its cost, about how stone and wood could shape history, but could never fully quiet the human heart. And somewhere in that mixture of echoes and silence, the story of this age of war, of longbows and iron rings, was preparing to turn again, to show not only how these tools won battles and held lands, but also how they weighed on the souls of those who lived with them, day after day, under restless skies that had seen many empires come and go, and would surely see more. As the years folded one into another, the castles of Edward's Ring began to feel less like new wounds in the land, and more like hard, pale stars in a man-made sky, each one shining its own cold light over the valleys and coasts of Wales. If someone could have risen so high above the mountains on a clear night, looking down with eyes that saw not only earth and water but purpose, they would have noticed how these strongholds formed patterns. Caernarfon watching the Menai Strait, Conwy guarding its twisting river, Harlech clinging to its rock by the sea, and others holding passes and harbours like fingers pressed on a map. From up there they might have seemed almost beautiful, a string of glowing points where fires burned inside walls and torches moved along battlements. But for the people who lived below, that beauty was always mixed with a sharp taste of fear and loss. Conwy, with its 8 great towers and thick curtain walls, was like a stone lantern perched above the river. By day it dominated the view, its reflection trembling on the water when the light was still. By night the sounds from inside, murmurs of men, the clank of armour, the creak of doors, floated down to the town, and the boats tied along the banks. The river itself did not care who owned its banks. It kept flowing to the sea, carrying fish, silt, and the pale ghosts of old stories. Yet now, every boat that passed below those walls did so under the gaze of archers and officers, under rules written far away. The bridge and the gate formed a narrow throat through which movement had to pass. What had once been an open way became a controlled point, a place where questions could be asked and tolls could be taken. To the garrison, this was order. To many others, it felt like a hand around the neck of the land. Harlech, farther down the coast, seemed almost like a dream when seen from the water. Its walls rose straight from the rock, with barely any space between cliff and stone. On stormy days, waves surged at its feet, sending spray up toward its lower towers. On calm days, the sea lay flat and grey, quietly admitting how quickly it could turn wild. A narrow, steep path wound up from a sheltered landing place to the castle gate, a path that could be held by a small number of men against a much larger force. Supplies could slip in this way even when the countryside was full of unrest. For those inside, that secret road was a comfort. For those outside, it was a reminder that the castle could endure even when the fields around it burned. Between these major strongholds were smaller fortresses and defended towns, each one a knot in the net. Roads, often improved or pushed through wild places at royal order, connected them. Ships carried goods and orders along the coast, their sails pale against the darker water. When a problem stirred in one part of Wales, word could travel quickly along these paths, and soldiers could follow. This was the true shape of the Ring of Iron, not only the castles themselves, but the lines of movement that flowed between them. like nerves in a body. The more these lines were used, the more they wore themselves into the daily life of the land. Markets were drawn toward castle towns. Laws were proclaimed in their squares. Coins, stamped with the king's face, passed from hand to hand under their shadows. Slowly, without loud announcement, the centres of gravity shifted. Places that had once looked to local princes and old hill forts now found their days circling around new stone hearts. Yet through all of this, the older Wales did not vanish. It lived in the language spoken at home, in songs sung where no soldier listened, in the way people remembered the shapes of hills and streams as something more than lines on a lord's map. In mountain villages, far from the sea castles, fires burned in low houses while stories were told about heroes and lost battles. Children grew up knowing both the outline of the faraway towers and the names of hidden paths through the bracken. When trouble came, some were ready to guide rebels, to shelter those who struck at the king's men before melting back into the folds of the land. The ring of iron could press down, but it could not reach into every fold at once. In this quiet, uneven struggle, architecture itself became a kind of language. The castles spoke in stone, saying, "We are here and we will stay." The people answered in movement, in small acts of resistance or cooperation, saying, "We see you, but we remember what was here before." A merchant who brought grain to Conwy's market might curse the taxes under his breath, yet still depend on the castle walls to keep raiders away. A shepherd who grazed his flock within sight of Harlech might spit when he saw its flags, yet also send his son to sell wool in the town that had grown at its feet. Few lives were simple in the shadow of this ring. Meanwhile, in other parts of Edward's wide realm, men were still practicing with the longbow, still learning to read fields and skies the way castle builders had learned to read coastlines and cliffs. On royal maps, the same ink that drew walls in Wales also traced roads to ports where armies could gather for campaigns in Scotland or France. It was all part of one way of seeing the world, as a place that could be shaped, channeled, and held by those who knew how to use stone, wood, and human effort together. In the quiet hours of some long night, it is possible to imagine a tired messenger riding from Caernarfon to Conwy, the moon lighting the path just enough to show the pale line of the road. As he passed farm after farm, hearing only the soft sounds of sleeping animals and the occasional bark of a dog, he might feel, for a moment, that the land itself was resting. Yet he would know that beyond the next bend, another great wall was waiting, another gate, another set of eyes on the tower. The ring never truly slept, even when men were off duty. The stones themselves held the memory of watchfulness. And if, in that same night, a fisherman on the coast looked back from his small boat toward the distant outline of Harlech, he might see only a dark shape against the stars. And for a brief moment, imagine what the shore would look like without it. The thought might pass, like a cloud over the moon, but it would leave a faint mark in his heart. Such small private questions about who owns a land, about what truly belongs, are not recorded in royal chronicles. Yet they move softly through history, shaping choices in ways no king can fully control. So the ring of iron shone on, not with warm light, but with the steady pale glow of power made solid. It held for a long time. It did what Edward meant it to do. It anchored his rule in Wales and tied that wild country into the same net of force and order that stretched over longbow fields and royal courts. But beneath its steady light, human lives went on weaving their own quieter patterns. Patterns that would, one day, gently tug at the edges of even the strongest chain, like waves wearing at rock, or like the slow, patient wind that never stops moving across the high, silent towers. In one of those castle towns, where the ring of iron touched the steady flow of everyday life, there lived a man who carried both worlds inside him, the world of the Longbow fields in France and the world of stone towers in Wales. He was not a knight, nor a great lord, just an aging archer whose back had begun to tighten with the memory of too many winters. Years earlier, he had stood on the slopes of Crécy and among the hedges at Poitiers, his fingers raw from drawing the bow, his eyes stinging with sweat and smoke. Now his post was on the walls of Conwy, where the river curved like a slow, thoughtful line beneath the high towers. Each morning he woke in a small room just off the war walk, the narrow slit of a window letting in a strip of pale light and the sound of gulls. His bow still rested near his bed, well cared for, its yew polished by many hands and much oil. But he used it less often now. More of his time was spent watching, pacing, and teaching younger men how to grip the wood, how to feel the pull of the string along their bones, rather than just in their skin. When he looked out from the battlements, he did not only see Wales. In quiet moments, the fields beyond the river blurred in his mind with other fields across the sea, where the grass had once been trampled and darkened by war. Sometimes, on misty mornings, when the air felt heavy and still, he imagined he could almost see the faint shapes of charging horses hidden in the shifting grey, or hear the distant rush of arrows that were no longer there. The younger soldiers listened with wide eyes when he spoke of Crécy and Poitiers, though he did not tell those stories often. When he did, he spoke in a low, even voice, not trying to make himself a hero. He described the slope, the stakes, the feeling of standing still while danger rushed toward you, trusting the bow and the plan, the way the air had seemed to crackle when hundreds of strings let fly at once. He talked about how knights in bright armour had fallen like any other men when hit in the right place, and how strange it had felt to see the old order crack in front of his own eyes. One boy, a Welsh recruit with dark hair and a careful gaze, listened more closely than the rest. He had grown up in a village that lay within sight of Conwy's towers, and the castle had always been both a threat and a shield in his stories. When he was small, he had played at throwing stones at invisible enemies, aiming at points on the walls where he imagined weakness might lie. Now he wore the king's colours and walked those same walls, his own footsteps echoing where he had once imagined others. To him, the old archer's tales were like puzzle pieces, linking the distant thunder of battles in France with the solid, constant weight of the castle above his childhood fields. When the older man showed him how to draw the bow the right way, using his whole body, the boy felt something settle inside him, a sense that he was joining a longer chain, one that stretched from villages and training butts to muddy ridges, and now to these stone crowns overlooking the river. One evening, as the sky turned slowly from blue to deep purple, the two of them stood together on the wall, looking out over the town and beyond it to the darkening shapes of hills. Lanterns were being lit below, small points of gold scattered like fallen stars along the streets and near the riverbank. The smell of cooking fires drifted up, mixed with the faint tang of the sea. The older man rested his hands on the parapet and spoke almost to himself. He said that in France, the longbow had felt like a storm they carried with them, something they could unpack on any field if they chose the ground well. Here, in Wales, the castles felt like frozen storms, always ready to break loose if needed. One moved, the other stayed still, but both were born from the same thought, that kings could shape the world to their will, not just with courage, but with planning, patience, and the quiet work of many hands. The Welsh boy listened, following the line of the river with his eyes. He thought of his family's small house somewhere beyond those hills, of the old tales his grandfather had told of princes who fought the English in wild valleys, ambushing them, and then disappearing into mist. He also thought of the steady pay he received now, of the bread on his mother's table, bought with coins stamped with the face of the same king whose banner flew above the tower where he stood. Inside him, loyalties and doubts tangled together like threads in a rough-woven cloth. He did not fully hate the castle, nor did he fully accept it. It was both prison and shelter, symbol and stone. When the older archer placed his bow in the boy's hands for a moment, letting him feel the weight of years carved into the smooth wood, there was a silence between them that said more than words about how war and power had changed. Men like them, who were not born into titles, now held tools that could decide battles and guard lands. Their skills were prized, but they were also trapped inside systems they had not chosen, placed on walls and in ranks according to orders given far away. The boy lifted the bow, feeling the curve of it pull gently against his palm, and asked whether, on the day of battle, fear ever truly went away. The older man smiled a little, lines deepening around his eyes. Fear, he said, never left, but it could be asked to stand aside for a time, pushed back by practice and by the comfort of knowing that others stood shoulder to shoulder with you. What mattered most was not being fearless, but doing your part in the pattern. Here in Conwy, the pattern was different from the open fields of France, but it was still a pattern. Walls, gates, watch posts, narrow stairs, firing positions marked out along the parapets. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a duty, and together they formed a web that could catch or break whatever tried to force its way through. As night deepened, the two of them walked their patrol in a slow circle around the castle, passing other guards, nodding to kitchen workers carrying late trays, listening to the hush that fell over the town as shutters closed and voices quieted. Above them, the towers of Conwy stood against the stars, their outlines steady and familiar. Far away across the sea, the battlefields of Crécy and Poitiers lay quiet now, their grass grown back, their scars hidden beneath soil and time. But the lessons learned there moved on in men's minds, and in the shape of armies and walls. The old archer and the young recruit could not see the whole arc of that story. They could only feel their small place in it, like two notes in a long, slow song that had begun before they were born and would continue after they were gone. And somewhere beyond the reach of the castle's lantern light, in the wide darkness where the river met the sea and the hills faded into shadow, the wind kept moving as it always had, carrying with it the faintest memory of arrows in flight and the unspoken questions of people who lived their lives beneath stone crowns and under the long, quiet shadow of kings. As seasons turned and the river by Conwy rose and fell with the rains, another castle farther down the coast kept its own lonely watch, standing where rock met sea in a meeting of cold grey surfaces. Harlech had always seemed a little apart, even among the ring of iron. Perched high on its crag, it looked not only over the land, but also far out across the shifting water, as if it listened for news carried by waves as much as for sounds drifting up from the valleys. To reach its gate from the shore, one had to climb a narrow path that wound upward like a question, turning back on itself in tight bends. For attackers, that path was a cruel test, exposed to arrows and stones. For those who lived inside, it was a lifeline, the road down which supplies and messages came when the countryside was unsettled. On soft evenings, when the wind gentled and the sea lay quiet as poured lead, a small boat might appear below, bringing grain, dried fish, or letters sealed with wax. Men would move down the path in a neat line, their torches making small islands of light in the growing dark, and for a moment the castle would seem less like a fist and more like a lantern, passing warmth and need between cliff and shore. Inside Harlech's walls, life followed patterns that both resembled and differed from those in Conwy or Caernarfon. The courtyards were tighter, hemmed in by sheer drops. The air smelled more strongly of salt, and the cry of seabirds was a constant thread in the day's sounds. When storms rolled in, the whole fortress seemed to tremble slightly, not with fear, but with the force of the wind battering its towers and the boom of waves below. Fires in the hearths became precious then, small pockets of comfort in a world of noise and cold. The garrison here had to learn a special kind of patience. While other castles watched busy roads or river crossings, Harlech often watched emptiness, the broad face of the sea, the open sky, the distant blur of mountains. Days could pass with no sign of friend or foe near the walls, only the slow drift of clouds and the regular turning of tides. Yet the men knew that this calm could be broken at any time, that the same sea that brought quiet fishing boats could also carry hostile sails. So they maintained their routines, patrols along the battlements, drills in the yard, checks of the secret water gate, and the path that coiled down to the landing place. Among them, too, there were archers, some veterans from campaigns abroad, some drawn from nearby Welsh families who had chosen the certainty of the king's pay over the uncertainty of life outside. They practiced in a corner of the outer ward where targets were set against a high wall, sending arrows thudding into wood while the wind pulled at their sleeves. For them, the longbow was both a memory and a promise. Those who had fought in France remembered fields crowded with men and horses, skies briefly thick with fletched shafts. Those who had not yet left Wales imagined those distant battles when they drew the string back and felt the weight of the bow strain against their chest and shoulders. In the evenings, as dusk blurred the point, where sea met sky, small circles formed around hearths. Stories flowed there as easily as ale, tales of narrow escapes on dark roads, of storms survived at sea, of distant lands where the wine tasted different and the churches rang their bells in unfamiliar patterns. Inevitably, the talk sometimes turned to why these walls had been raised in the first place, to the old wars between princes of Wales and the English king, whose banner now flew above the keep. Some voices spoke in anger, others in resignation, others in the flat, practical tone of men who had chosen to live with what was rather than with dreams of what might have been. One young archer, whose grandfather had died fighting against the first wave of Edward's campaigns, sat quietly during such talk, his fingers tracing the grain of his bow where it lay across his knees. To him, Harlech was both inheritance and contradiction. It loomed in the stories of his childhood as a symbol of loss, yet it also put food on his family's table and gave him a skill that made him valuable. When he walked the wall at night, he sometimes found himself whispering old Welsh songs under his breath, songs that spoke of hills, freedom, and the fierce pride of princes long gone. The stones did not answer, but the sea sometimes seemed to, its endless motion, like a reminder that nothing, not even the hardest rock, remained unchanged forever. On a certain night, with clouds torn into long, pale strips by the wind, and the moon slipping in and out of their cover, Harlech felt especially distant from the rest of the world. A storm was building out beyond the horizon, its hidden heart marked by flashes of far lightning that turned the sea's surface briefly silver. The garrison was on high alert, knowing that bad weather could be the friend of those who wished to approach unseen. Archers were stationed along the walls, bows unstrung but ready, eyes straining into the shifting dark. The young archer with the rebel grandfather stood at a point where he could see both the landward slopes and the seagate below. As he watched, the rhythm of the waves and the surge of wind began to blend in his mind with the remembered explanations of older soldiers, how to judge distance by sound when sight was poor, how to listen for the difference between wind in rock and the scrape of something human on stone. War, he was beginning to understand, was not only what happened in bright, clear battles, it was also this: long hours of listening, of waiting, of holding a bow that might not be loosed for days, and yet must never feel entirely at rest in the hand. Somewhere inland, other forts and towns kept their own watches, their own anxieties humming under the routines of guard duty and gate checks. The ring of iron, seen from far away in royal imagination, might have looked like a simple thing, a chain of strong points, linked neatly and shining with certainty. But from inside, each link had its own character, its own mix of boredom and fear, of loyalty and doubt. Men in Harlech did not think every day about grand strategies or the long sweep of Plantagenet rule. They thought about the next ship due with supplies, about the state of the roof over the barracks, about the stiffness in their drawing arm. And yet, in tending these small concerns, they kept the larger design alive. If someone, years later, were to sit by a window with a candle and read about this time in a thick book, they might only see lines about conquest and control, about how Edward's castles secured his hold on Wales. They might see a few famous names, a list of dates, perhaps a mention of a siege or two, or. They would not know the feel of salt on lips after a day on Harlech's walls, or the sound of a bowstring being tested by calloused fingers in a quiet corner of the yard, or the way the smell of wet stone and seaweed mingled in the air after rain. Yet those small sensory things were the threads from which the larger cloth was woven. In the same way, when people spoke of the longbow as a revolutionary weapon, they rarely mentioned the years of practice in village fields, the aches, the small triumphs, when an arrow finally struck true. But without those, there would have been no storms of arrows over Crécy or Poitiers, no shaken faith in shining armour. So in Harlech, as in Conwy and Caernarfon, and on distant French ridges, the quiet work went on. Guards walked, archers trained, stories were told and retold, slowly blurring the line between personal memory and legend. Above them all, the towers stood solid against the changing sky, and below them, the sea kept breathing its slow, endless breath. Somewhere within that steady rise and fall, within the crumbling edges of old resentments and the firm lines of carved stone, the age of castles and longbows moved a little closer to its next turning, a turning that would show more clearly than ever how heavy the burden of all this strength could become for those forced to live beneath it. In the long, slow turning of years, the weight of so many walls and weapons began to press not only on the bodies of those who carried them, but also on their hearts. In villages tucked between Welsh hills, people grew up never having known a sky without the outline of some distant tower, or a road that did not, at some point, pass under a foreign gate. For them, the ring of iron was not a sudden shock. It was the background of life, as steady and unchanging as the changing weather. Yet, even when something becomes ordinary, it still leaves marks. A child walking with a bundle of firewood could feel it in the way grown-ups lowered their voices when a mounted patrol approached. A woman selling bread in a market square could feel it in the weight of the coins she received, stamped with a king's face from far away. A shepherd, watching his flock, could feel it in the way the morning light caught first on stone battlements before it touched the slopes below. In the same way, on the other side of the sea, the longbow became part of the everyday breath of England. Archery practice was not only a matter of royal orders. It wove itself into festivals, into games, into quiet evenings when fathers showed their sons how to stand, how to draw, how to breathe. On church greens and at the edges of fields, targets were set up, and the sound of arrows striking wood or straw became as familiar as the calling of crows. In some turning point of the age, war had slipped into the rhythm of ordinary life so smoothly that many did not notice. Bows and castles were like two hands of the same mind, one reaching out across open fields, the other closing around valleys and towns. For the kings of the Plantagenet line, this seemed, for a time, like the height of strength. They could summon storms of arrows against their enemies and retreat into stone crowns if things went wrong. Maps spread before them showed not only borders, but also strings of castles and lists of archers ready to serve. Yet strength, when held for too long and too tightly, can grow heavy. In castle halls, lit by flickering torches, some older officers began to feel that heaviness when they looked at the accounts of food, pay, and repairs. To keep a ring of iron shining was costly. Stone cracked in frost. Wooden roofs rotted in the rain. Garrison wages had to be counted out in hard coin. Arrows had to be made, bows replaced, armour mended. Every wall that stood against the wind also stood on the shoulders of many unseen workers. At Harlech, a quartermaster with ink-stained fingers might sit at a rough table scratching numbers onto a piece of parchment, adding up grain shipments from inland farms and salted fish from the coast. Each figure meant hours of labour for someone. The farmer bending in the field, the fisherman hauling nets, the carter guiding his horse up steep, muddy tracks. When storms delayed a ship or bandits troubled a road, the lines of supply trembled, and men on the walls felt it in smaller rations and shorter tempers. Power, it turned out, was not a simple tower thrust into the sky. It was a chain of needs reaching all the way down to the lowest cottage. In Conwy, the ageing archer who had seen Crécy might feel this truth in the stiffness of his own hands. There were days now when cold made it hard for him to pull the bow to its full draw. He could still teach, still shout corrections to younger men, but his body remembered every damp night, every march, every long watch on the wall. He sometimes caught himself wondering what it had all added up to. Armour had been humbled in France, yet lords still rode in plate and carried banners. Castles had locked down Wales, yet soft talk of unrest still flickered, like candle flames in quiet corners. Perhaps, he thought on some evenings, war never truly ends anything. It only changes the questions people ask. The Welsh recruit, who had once listened wide-eyed, now began to see more clearly the cracks between the stones of his world. He knew the castle's routines by heart. When the gates opened at dawn, how often patrols circled. Where the blind spots lay in the fields of view from certain towers. He also knew the faces in the town below. The baker, who slipped him an extra crust when the day had been long. The old woman who still crossed herself twice when English soldiers passed, as if warding off a curse. He did his duty, yet inside, two loyalties pulled at him like tides, the pull of his pay and comradeship on the walls, and the pull of old songs and family stories that spoke of a Wales before iron crowns. On a certain autumn day, when the air was bright and cold and the leaves on the lower slopes had turned red and gold, a small incident brought these tensions into sharp focus. A group of villagers from a nearby hamlet arrived at Conwy's gate with carts of grain owed in tax. They had come many times before, but that year a poor harvest had bitten deep. The sacks on their carts were fewer, faces were thinner, eyes more tired. At the gatehouse, an English officer in a fine cloak counted the bags with a stern, practised gaze. His orders were clear. The quota must be met, for the castle's stores were running low after a long season of bad weather and extra patrols. When the numbers did not add up, his voice hardened. He spoke of duty, of law, of the king's needs. The villagers answered in halting English and flowing Welsh, explaining that the fields had simply not given more, that their children already knew the taste of hunger. The air between them seemed to grow tight, as if the very stones were listening. The Welsh recruit stood nearby, spear in hand, watching faces he recognised from his own visits home. He saw the tremor in an old man's hands as he lifted a sack to prove it was not half filled. He saw the officer's impatience growing, heard the muttered word rebellion like a spark dropped into dry grass. For a brief moment the longbow hanging on the wall behind him seemed to weigh more than usual, not as a weapon against foreign knights, but as a symbol of all the pressure being pushed down onto people who had never seen France, never cared about Plantagenet claims across the sea. The moment passed without blood. A compromise was reached. Part of the tax delayed, part taken in rough woolen labour instead of grain. The officer wrote it down with a tight mouth, the villagers left with lighter carts and heavier hearts. But for the young soldier, something had shifted. He walked his patrol that night with the usual care, yet his thoughts moved in new circles. He remembered the old archer's words about patterns, about everyone having a place in the design of war and rule. Now he wondered who had drawn that design, and for whom. The castle above him was still solid, the tower tops still cut clean shapes against the stars. The ring of iron still did its work, holding the land in a firm embrace. But inside that ring, small questions like his were beginning to form in many minds. Questions about cost, about belonging, about how long stone and steel could hold against the quieter, slower forces of memory and desire. Far away, on the now peaceful fields, where arrows had once fallen like rain, grass grew over old scars. Children played where knights had died, chasing one another through places marked only in history books. The longbow still bent in practised hands, but gunpowder and new weapons waited somewhere at the edge of the future, like distant thunder that had not yet reached these shores. And in Wales the castle still stood, but the stories told in their shadows were changing, weaving long threads of endurance and quiet resistance into the fabric of an age that had thought stone and yew could settle everything. Somewhere in that slow weaving, along the high walls of Harlech and the busy streets of Caernarfon, another path was quietly beginning to open, one that would show how even the hardest iron rings must one day loosen when the hearts they encircle keep beating to their own older rhythm. As seasons drifted past like slow-moving clouds over the Welsh hills, the castles of the Iron Ring settled into their roles not only as fortresses, but as quiet teachers. They taught through their presence, through the way they stood on ridges and riverbanks, through the long shadows they cast at dawn and dusk. For people who lived within sight of their walls, every day was a lesson in what it meant for architecture to become a weapon, and for silence itself to turn into a warning. In Caernarfon, the striped stone of the towers did more than keep out enemies. It told a story every time the sun touched it, the story of a king who wanted to dress his power in the clothes of empires long dead, to say, without words, that his rule was not just strong, but meant to last. Children who grew up there did not need someone to explain this. They felt it in the way their parents spoke of going up to the castle with a certain careful tone, in the way markets were arranged so that the best stalls lay near the walls, where officials could watch. The gate did not have to be closed for people to remember it could be. The knowledge was simply there, like the taste of salt in the air by the sea. In Conwy, the straight streets and encircling walls shaped more than traffic. They shaped thought. The town's neat layout, with its right angles and clear lines, contrasted sharply with the older crooked paths of nearby villages. Within the walls, bells marked the rhythm of the day, curfews were announced. Guards at the gates asked questions. Who are you? What do you carry? Where are you going? Over time, these questions became an invisible frame around people's movements, so that even when no soldier was watching, many chose their words and routes as if one might be. It was a kind of architecture that reached into the mind, building its own corridors there. Harlech, with its steep path and sheer drops, taught a different lesson. It spoke of isolation and endurance. Looking up at its high walls from the shoreline, a fisherman might feel, deep in his chest, the sense that this place could withstand almost anything thrown against it. That feeling could be both comforting and crushing. Comforting, because if danger came from the sea, the castle stood between it and the inland valleys. Crushing, because it reminded everyone how hard it would be to shake off such a presence if they ever wished to. The stone seemed to say, I am here, and there is no easy way around me. Inside these castles, silence often meant more than noise. A quiet courtyard at midday, with only a few men crossing from one doorway to another, could feel heavy with unspoken rules. The absence of shouting did not mean freedom, it meant order, a stillness kept in place by the understanding that to break it would bring swift, hard answers. In the town below, a sudden hush falling over a group of people when a patrol turned the corner spoke just as loudly as any spoken complaint. Silence became a shield against trouble, a way of hiding thoughts and fears. It also became a sharp edge, cutting off open discussion of the past and of what had been lost. For the Welsh recruit on Conwy's wall, now a little older and a little less easily impressed, these layers of meaning grew clearer with time. He noticed that his mother's voice always dropped when she mentioned walking past the castle on market days, even though she was proud that her son wore its colours. He noticed how some elders in the village would turn their faces slightly away when the towers were mentioned, as if they could lessen their presence by refusing to give them their full gaze. He noticed how his younger cousins, who had never known a world without walls on the horizon, sometimes drew castles in the dirt with sticks, their small fingers tracing towers and flags without thinking what they represented. The ageing archer, visiting Caernarfon once on an errand that took him from Conwy along the coast, felt something similar as he walked under its grand gate. The architecture of this place seemed to press down from above, the tall towers and echoing passages magnifying even small sounds. His boots on the stone floor sounded too loud to his own ears. Voices bounced back from walls, making it hard to tell exactly where a person was just by listening. It reminded him of the way a battlefield could sometimes deceive the senses, how the clash of weapons and cries of men could bounce off hills and trees, making danger seem nearer or farther than it really was. Here, though, the confusion was not born of chaos, but of design. The castle was built to make invaders feel lost and small. It did the same, in a quieter way, to those who lived under its rule. Over time, people learned to read these spaces like texts written in stone. A narrow stair twisting inside a tower meant control, forcing anyone who climbed it to move slowly and in single file. A wide hall near the gate, with high windows and banners, meant display, a place where the king's officers could hold court and remind everyone of who sat above them in the great chain of command. A small postern door, half hidden in the curtain wall, meant possibility, an escape in time of siege, a secret way in for messengers, or, in whispered dreams, a weak point that might one day be used to reclaim what had been taken. In this way, architecture and imagination met. The same stone that weighed on people's shoulders also gave them shapes to dream around. Tales began to grow of brave souls slipping through gates at night, of secret meetings in shadowed corners just out of sight of the ramparts, of ghosts of old princes walking unafraid on walls meant to confine their descendants. None of these stories made the castles crumble, but they kept something alive inside the people, the sense that not everything solid and silent was unchangeable. Meanwhile, the longbow remained its own kind of quiet warning across the sea. On feast days in England, when contests were held and men showed off their skill, the air filled not with shouting about glory, but with the soft repeated twang of bowstrings and the solid thuds of arrows striking home. Every clean shot was a reminder of what had happened to proud knights who had once believed themselves safe behind armour. Every boy who grew up feeling the deep pull of the bow in his bones carried forward the understanding that strength could come from training and patience as much as from birth and title. Together, these two forces, the castles in Wales and the longbows in England, drew a new outline around the island. They marked where power sat and how it moved. They showed that force no longer belonged only to a handful of mounted nobles. It had sunk into stone and spread into ranks of common men, into routines and habits that reached into nearly every life. Yet under that outline, invisible but real, another shape was forming, the shape of quiet, smouldering resistance. It lived in glances exchanged when tax carts rolled past, in the way certain songs were only sung indoors with shutters closed, in the way some men and women held themselves a little straighter when they walked under the castle's shadow, as if refusing to bow inward even when they bowed their heads. The castles could not hear those thoughts, and the maps in royal chambers did not show them, but they were there, like embers buried under ash, warm and waiting. And as night after night passed over Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and all the smaller stones between, the sky above them knew, if skies can be said to know, that there would come a time when the silence these walls had enforced would be broken by different kinds of voices, and when the dark, quiet places in the hills would glow again with a fire that did not come from any king's command, but from something older and harder to put out. There were nights in Wales when the sky felt heavy and close, as if it, too, were listening to the quiet beneath it. On those nights, when the moon was hidden and only a few stars dared to shine, the villages tucked into the folds of the hills seemed to draw in their breath. Doors were barred early, hearth fires burned low, and the noise of the castles faded into the distance like the memory of a bad dream. Yet, under that silence, something small and bright moved from house to house, almost like a flame passed cupped between careful hands. It was not open revolt, not great armies gathering, but the soft, stubborn refusal to forget. In a low smoke-darkened room in one such village, an old man sat by the hearth with a boy at his feet. The fire was down to embers, glowing like sleeping eyes. Outside, the shape of Conwy's towers showed faintly against the clouds, a darker black on the edge of the sky. The old man's hands were marked by age and work, the skin thin over strong bones. He told the boy stories he had heard from his own grandfather, stories of leaders who had once called men to their banners with horns and shouted vows, of ambushes in narrow passes, of nights when no foreign flag flew over the valleys. He did not speak these tales loudly. The walls in such houses knew how to carry sound, and ears outside might be less friendly than the night itself. But he spoke clearly enough for the boy to hear, and the boy's eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight. To this child, the castle in the distance was part of the world, like the hills and streams. Yet the old man's words painted another picture over the one he knew, like a shadow drawing itself over a familiar face. Somewhere between those two pictures, the boy's heart began to find its own shape, learning that there could be more than one way to see the same land. In another valley, not far from Harlech, a group of farmers gathered in a barn that smelled of hay and animals. The doors were shut against the wind, and only one small lantern burned, its light soft and yellow. They spoke in low voices about a new tax, about a harsh officer in a nearby town, about a patrol that had pushed a shepherd aside on a narrow track. No one there had the power to pull down walls or drive out garrisons. They had families, fields, and the weariness of long days on their shoulders. But they did have something else, a knowledge of every dip and turn in the land, of paths that did not appear on any map hanging in a castle hall. They shared this knowledge now, tracing lines in the dust with the rough fingers, planning small acts that might ease the pressure without drawing too much fire down upon them. A wagon load of grain might take a slightly longer road, slipping past places where greedy hands waited. A warning might travel ahead of a tax collector, giving people time to hide a little of their best goods. On some foggy morning, a pile of stones might fall by accident across a steep path used by soldiers, delaying them just long enough that they arrived late and tired, their temper blunted. None of this looked like glory. It was not the kind of thing that would be sung about in grand halls. Yet it was its own kind of resistance, moving quietly through the days like roots beneath the soil, slowly pushing against the weight above. Back in Conwy, the Welsh soldier on the wall began to notice signs of this quiet struggle, more clearly than he had before. When he went home on leave, he saw how carefully his mother counted out every coin, how she folded her old shawl around her shoulders before stepping out, as if armour could be made from cloth and habit. He saw the way his uncle paused when the castle came into view along the road, his jaw tightening for a heartbeat before he forced his face smooth again. At the well in the village, women shared more than water. They shared bits of news. A new order posted in the market, a sermon that had seemed to favour the king more than God, a friend's son pressed into service on the walls. Their voices were low but firm. They spoke not as people who had given up, but as people who knew they must bend for now if they wanted to still be standing later. The soldier found himself standing between worlds more than ever. On the walls, he wore his duty like a cloak, watching the roads, checking the gates, training with the bow. In the village, he felt the older rhythm of his people, the way they blended caution with humour, sorrow with stubbornness. Some nights he lay awake, listening to the faint echoes of boots on the castle stones and the much softer sounds of his family breathing in sleep, and he wondered which sound would still be heard in this land when he was gone. Was it possible, he asked himself, for a castle and a people to share the same space without one crushing the other completely? Or would one have to yield in the end, like a tree cut down to make room for a tower, or a tower left to crumble when no one cared to repair it anymore? Far to the south, along roads that wound between other hills and rivers, messengers still carried orders from the king's council. They spoke of new campaigns, of money needed for wars that ordinary farmers would never see, in places their tongues stumbled to pronounce. The Ring of Iron in Wales was just one piece of a larger puzzle to those who wrote such letters, a problem of control and supply to be balanced with others. Yet, those same orders turned into real footsteps on real roads, into real demands at village doors, into dull aches in the backs of men and women and children who lifted more than their share so that walls and bows could be kept ready. In this way, the greatest weight of war and conquest did not always fall on those wearing armour or holding weapons. It often fell on those whose only battles were with weather, hunger, and the slow wearing down of hope. And yet hope did not die. It simply changed its shape. It stopped looking like sudden victory and began to look like survival, like holding on to a language, a song, a way of naming the hills. It looked like teaching children the old place names in a whisper while walking the same paths that soldiers marched, like carving small symbols into the beams of a house that no officer would recognize, but that spoke clearly to anyone who knew the stories behind them. On a winter night when snow lay thick on the high ground, and even the sea seemed tired, a small group gathered in a farmhouse, on the edge of Caernarfon's shadow. A harp rested against a wall, its wood worn smooth where many hands had held it. The man who played it was no great bard from a prince's court, just a local musician with a good ear and a strong memory. He sang in Welsh, his voice low so as not to draw unwanted attention, and the song he chose told of a time long before Edward's castles, when the land itself seemed to rise in answer to the call of its own rulers. The children in the room leaned close. The adults closed their eyes for a moment, letting the melody carry them somewhere beyond the here and now. For the length of that song, the towers outside were only shapes on the horizon, distant and dim. The true walls around them were made of breath and sound and shared memory. When the song ended, the castle still stood. The ring of iron had not cracked, but something inside each listener felt a little stronger, a little more their own. Perhaps that was the deepest kind of resistance, the one no army could fully conquer. The decision, made quietly and renewed every day, to keep a memory alive. Did the kings in their far-off chambers understand this? Did they know that while their walls held bodies and roads, the hearts of the people they ruled were still walking old paths under older stars? Maybe they did. A little. Maybe that was why the Ring of Iron was built so strong in the first place, out of a fear that conquest on paper was never enough. And somewhere, beyond the reach of any castle's light, the future was gathering itself like clouds on a far horizon, preparing to show how such quiet, ember-like endurance could change the course of things in ways no one at that moment could yet clearly see, but which the hills and the restless wind had already begun to feel. Centuries do not turn with a sudden crack. They turn the way night turns into dawn, slowly, with long stretches where the world seems half one thing and half another. In the lands once held by the Plantagenets, the age of longbows and iron rings began to feel that slow turning. New sounds crept into the music of war. The dull, shocking boom of gunpowder, the roar of cannon, the strange, harsh smell of smoke that did not come from simple campfires. At first, these new weapons seemed clumsy and uncertain, more like dangerous toys than tools to reshape the world. Bows still bent in practiced hands, arrows still flew in graceful arcs, castles still stood solid on their rocks. But underneath, the ground of history was shifting, and the old forms of strength were beginning to sense it the way an old tree feels, deep in its roots, the approach of a different season. On some forgotten field, a line of archers might have stood as they always had, bows ready, backs strong, only to see, across the way, not just knights and spearmen, but dark shapes of early guns, resting on wooden frames. The sound of their first shots would have been shocking, like thunder torn from a clear sky. Smoke would billow, white and thick, hiding faces for a moment. The bullets themselves, still rough and imperfect, might miss as often as they struck, yet the message carried by that noise was clear. There was now a way to send death forward without the smooth, silent grace of an arrow's flight. For men who had spent their lives trusting the longbow, this must have felt both insulting and sad, as if someone had taken a beautiful song and replaced it with a cough. In Wales, where the castles of Edward's Ring still watched the hills and coasts, the new age came just as slowly, but just as surely. At first the towers did not tremble. Their walls were thick enough to shrug off small cannonballs, their gates strong enough to resist blasts that were more smoke than force. Life inside went on. Guards walked, priests prayed, cooks stirred pots, and children ran through courtyards chasing one another around wells and under arches. But word of new sieges in other places where walls had begun to crack under sustained bombardment drifted in with travellers and soldiers. The idea that stone itself could be broken open from a distance, that height and thickness were no longer unshakable shields, began to whisper at the edges of thought like a chill wind under a door. The Welsh soldier who had once wrestled with his place between castle and village grew older in this changing world. His hair silvered at the temples, his draw on the bow grew a little slower, but he still knew the feel of the string in his fingers better than almost anything else. He heard rumours of battles where guns had played a larger part, where smoke had covered fields so thickly that men could barely see one another. He felt a quiet ache at the thought that the careful art he had given his youth too might one day be set aside, not because it had failed, but simply because something louder had taken its place. Yet when he went home, when he walked the same paths between hedges and over small streams, he saw that in the villages the real measure of time was different. There, the sheep still needed tending. The grain still needed sowing and reaping. The winters still needed enduring. New weapons might change who held the keys to the castles, but they did not change the shape of the hills or the way people looked to them for meaning. The ring of iron itself began slowly to trade some of its sharpness for a different kind of life. In some places garrisons shrank, towers were less carefully maintained, and stone that had once been guarded with fierce attention started to crumble at the edges. Moss thickened in cracks, weeds pushed up between flagstones. In Caernarfon, one might imagine a day when a traveller from far away walked under the great gate, not as a soldier or a subject, but as a curious visitor. He would look up at the striped walls and the proud towers and feel awe, yes, but also a gentle sadness, sensing how much effort and fear had been needed to raise such a place. He might run his hand along the cold stone and think of the hands that had carried each block, of the lives lived in the rooms, now quiet, of the Welsh children who had grown up in its shadow, learning to live with something that was never built for their comfort. At Harlech, the wind still climbed the cliffs, still wrapped itself around the towers, but the voices it met there changed. Fewer commands were shouted. More bird calls echoed in empty chambers. Grass grew where boots had once worn paths smooth. From the sea, the castle looked as striking as ever, but up close, its scars showed. Fallen stones, worn steps, carvings softened by rain and time. The land was gently taking back what had been forced upon it, not with sudden violence, but with the endless patience of weather and growth. In Conwy, the straight streets and encircling walls might in time have become less instruments of control and more simple features of a town where markets bustled and children played. The questions asked at the gates grew fewer and less sharp. What had once been a strict border between inside and outside blurred. People from different places mingled more freely, and the tight knot of fear that had once lived in every closed door began, little by little, to loosen. Yet, even as the strictness eased, the memory of what those walls had meant remained, stored in stories told by elders whose grandparents had seen harsher days. And what of the longbow in this world where guns now shouted louder? It did not vanish all at once. For a long time, the two weapons shared the same fields, the bow offering accuracy and speed, the gun offering raw power and noise. But slowly, as kings and commanders turned their eyes toward whatever seemed most modern and impressive, the old bow was asked to step back. Fewer boys learned to feel its pull from childhood. Fewer villages rang with the soft thud of arrows on practiced targets each Sunday. The deep grooves in the bones of archers' arms and shoulders appeared less often in the graveyards of the future. And yet, in a way, the longbow had already done its lasting work. It had shown the world that lines of common men, trained and trusted, could break the charge of the proudest knights. It had proved that planning and patience could shape victory as surely as bright armour and fine blood. It had left its shadow in the way armies thought, in the way kings measured distance and time. Even when the boughs themselves were laid aside, their echo remained, like the lingering shake in the air after a storm has passed. In Wales, too, the echo of the Ring of Iron lingered in minds and in the lines of the landscape. Even as the castles aged and their military importance faded, they stayed on the hills and riverbanks, their silhouettes still cutting the sky at sunrise and sunset. People walked past them now with baskets or with books instead of spears, but the old feelings did not vanish entirely. A child looking up at Harlech might still feel a small shiver of awe. A singer in Caernarfon might still let their voice rise a little louder, to see if it could fill a hall once meant for lords alone. Perhaps that is how history often ends one chapter and begins another, not by wiping away what came before, but by changing what it means. The same stones that once stood for conquest become, in time, places where memories are kept. The same fields that once drank the blood of knights and archers become quiet meadows, where people walk their dogs or sit to watch the clouds. The same stories that once divided slowly begin to be told as shared tales, reminders of a hard past that shaped a softer present. And somewhere, in the long thread that runs from the first drawn bowstring to the last crumbling tower stone, the story of this age of war, of long bows like wooden storms, and castles like iron crowns, waits for a final, gentle telling, one that will not argue or accuse, but simply look back with calm eyes and ask what all this strength left behind in the hearts of those who lived through it and in the quiet of the lands that outlasted every king. In the end, when the long story of bows and stone rings had stretched itself across so many years that most of the people who had lived inside it were only names in old books or faces worn smooth on carved tombs, the land itself remained quiet and patient, like someone who has listened to a long conversation and now lets the echoes fade. The fields where arrows had once risen in black clouds became once more just fields, places where cattle grazed, where children ran with bare feet through the grass, where the only lines drawn in the earth were for ploughs and not for battle. The ridges that had given Edward III his advantage at Crécy and Poitiers still stood, their slopes softened by time and weather, holding no sign on their surface of the knights who had fallen there. Yet if a person walked those fields at dusk, when the light grows gentle and the world feels half awake and half asleep, they might sense something lingering in the air, not ghosts in armour, but the faint memory of choices made long ago. Choices about where to stand, how to trust ordinary hands with the fate of kingdoms, how to let a simple piece of wood and string change the balance of power. In Wales, the castles of the Iron Ring watched many such evenings come and go. Caernarfon's striped towers still caught the low sun, turning gold for a brief moment before the light slipped away. Conwy's walls still traced their careful circle around streets that now held shops and homes instead of barracks and storerooms. Harlech still clung to its rock, its silhouette sharp against the sky, though inside its once busy yards there might now be more wildflowers than weapons, more footsteps of visitors than of marching soldiers. People came to these places not to obey orders, but to look, to imagine, to touch the cold stone, and try to feel through their fingertips some connection to the lives that had once filled these rooms with urgency. Guides told stories in soft voices. Children peered through arrow slits and laughed to see how narrow the world looked from inside them. Old men sat on benches where guards had once stood, resting their bones and watching the play of clouds above towers that no longer threatened. The castles had not vanished. They had simply changed their work. They no longer held a land in a hard grip. Instead, they held memories, both bitter and proud, giving shape to tales of conquest and endurance, of fear and stubborn hope. In small houses scattered through the valleys, songs survive too, though sometimes their words had shifted over time, like stones in a stream. A harp string still vibrated under the touch of a careful hand. A voice still rose in the language of the hills, telling of princes and rebels, of long marches and narrow escapes. The Ring of Iron had never managed to silence that music completely. It had forced it lower for a time, tucked it behind barred doors and under watchful shutters, but once the pressure eased, the old notes rose again, not in anger now, but in remembrance. And somewhere in English villages, where practice butts had long since rotted, and the law no longer called men out to shoot on Sundays, a dusty bough or two might still hang above a hearth, its wood darkened by smoke and years. A descendant, running fingers along it, might not know exactly where his forefathers had stood, whether on French ridges under a rain of arrows or on Welsh walls under a wet sky, but he could feel in the curve of the bough the echo of the strength it had once demanded. The years of patient practice that had turned simple villages into the sharp edge of a king's will. History, perhaps, is most truly kept, not in the loud moments of battle, but in these quieter traces, in the way a road bends around a hill because a castle once stood there, in the way a family's stories still carry the name of a field that saw something important centuries ago, in the way a language survives, carrying within it old words for courage and loss that no conqueror ever quite manages to erase. The Plantagenet kings who ordered castles to be razed and longbowmen to be trained did not stay. Their banners changed, their lines broke, their crowns passed to other hands. The tools they relied on, those iron crowns of stone in Wales, those wooden storms of arrows in France, outlived them in different ways, turning from instruments of fear into quiet reminders. They show us, when we look back, that war is not only a matter of winners and losers, but a long, heavy thing that presses on everyone it touches. The archer with his aching shoulders, the mason hauling stone in the rain, the child in a valley who grows up under a shadow and must decide what that shadow means. And yet even with all that weight, the world does not stay forever in the grip of any one age. New weapons come, old walls crumble. What seemed unshakable turns out to be only another layer in the long, patient building of the human story. Perhaps the deepest change is not in the tools, but in the questions people ask when they look back. Instead of wondering only who won and who lost, they begin to ask what it felt like to stand on those walls, to sleep under those towers, to draw that bow in fear and hope, to live day after day in a world where strength was measured in stone and string. When such questions are asked gently, without hurry, the past begins to soften, to open, to show not just its hardness, but also its fragile human centre. And so, on some quiet evening in our own time, a listener might lie in bed while rain taps softly at the window, hearing these old stories spoken slowly in a low, calm voice. They might picture the sloping fields of Crécy under a grey sky, the hedged approaches of Poitiers, where arrows whispered through the leaves, the striped walls of Caernarfon glowing in the last light, the lonely towers of Harlech standing above a restless sea. They might feel, for a moment, both the weight of those places and the strange comfort of knowing that they belong now to memory more than to fear. If that listener lets their eyes grow heavy, the names and dates may begin to blur, but the feeling will remain that people long ago stood under the same moon, felt the same wind, worried about their families, and tried in their own difficult times to find a way to live between power and peace. Perhaps as sleep comes closer, they will feel a quiet gratitude for the archers and the masons, the singers and the storytellers, the unknown villagers who carried their part of the burden and still found room in their hearts for stubborn hope. And in that soft place between waking and dreaming, they might let the castles fade into mist, let the arrows fall gently to the ground, and rest in the simple thought that the land, in the end, forgives more than it remembers. Thank you for walking so patiently through these old, shadowed halls and over these long, sloping fields. Now the story has folded itself into silence for a while. You can close your eyes, let the last images drift away like smoke, and perhaps, somewhere in your dreams tonight, you will meet them again. The archers on the ridge, the guards on the windy walls, the quiet people in the valleys, moving softly through a world where the battles are long over and only the calm remains.